How Gamefreak almost made a 2D open world Pokemon game. Maybe this is going to make you sad because it's going to be how you could have gotten a good Pokemon game from Gamefreak at some point.
One of the most fascinating revelations from a Pokemon Terra leak was the discovery of the 2008 builds of Pokemon Black and White. These builds were created over 2 years before the game.
I never finished Black and White. I was one of those people who, when Black and White came out, I was not a fan. But looking back on them, they're actually really good. And then Black and White too. Yeah, I stopped playing Pokemon at Black and White. I did not like the idea that you just you just did not have any of the last generation Pokemon. Like that's what like it. Yeah, I kind of miss that. Anyway,
games officially launched, giving us a glimpse into the very early stages of Generation 5's development. These builds were also developed during the production of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, so they include sprites and even beta versions of towns from Generation 4's Johto. From the Terra leak,
I love Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and I know a lot of people say, oh, Gen 2 area's not balanced because Kanto's weird. Yeah, I get it. At the same time, I really like the idea that you can go to Johto. You start in Johto, you can go to Kanto. It's so fucking cool. It is so cool.
We learned that Gamefreak typically begin rough conceptual planning for the next generation of Pokemon games, while still...
You could use prior Pokemon once you beat Black and White for the record. Yeah, but then I had to beat it, and I wasn't like that. I wasn't a fan. Also, you got the Pokewalker in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and that was really cool. I like the Pokewalker.
Working on the current one. This suggests that pre-production for Pokemon Black and White may have started as early as 2005 or 2006. By the time the studio had finished Pokemon Platinum and moved on to Heart Gold and Soul Silver, it seems reasonable to assume that full production on Black and White began around 2008. So the earliest playable build of Pokemon Black and White dates back to August 2008. This suggests
oh my god, holy shit.
suggests that by this time, development on Heart Gold and Soul Silver had progressed enough for Gamefreak to shift part of their focus and split the project into the Generation 5 build. And at this stage, you wouldn't expect much from such an early build. Perhaps you'd expect something that feels like a slightly altered Pokemon Platinum. However, the August build offers an intriguing glimpse into how Gamefreak initially envisioned Generation 5. Rather than sticking to the familiar framework of previous games, it focuses heavily on world building and experimenting with how gameplay could evolve. It's clear.
Remember when Gamefreak made cool things? Remember when Gamefreak wasn't modern Gamefreak and made just slop after slop? Remember how Pokemon used to look cool? And then they did Sky Battles, and then they're just like, okay, every flying Pokemon's just T-posing now, because we don't want to animate things. There is no reason why Game Freak should make garbage games. Pokemon is such a popular franchise. There is no reason why Pokemon games shouldn't be absolute bangers.
From the environment design that they were already conceptualizing the next generation's unique identity. By this point, Game Freak definitely knew that the next game would be set in a New York-inspired region. However, the specifics of gameplay and technical implementation were still being explored.
You could say that for many other AAA game studios. That's true. That's true. But the difference is Pokemon still sells well, and a lot of others don't. So, there's at least that distinction. Game Freak Game Freak is not going out of business. A lot of the AAA game studios are, though.
The August build reflects this early experimental phase, showcasing some remarkably ambitious ideas. The layout is drastically different from anything in the first 4 generations, featuring a massive open sandbox area with a freely rotating 3D camera and varied expansive landscapes. This was a radical departure from the typical more grid-based constrained map. In many ways,
that would have been... It probably would have... I imagine the reason they didn't go down this route is hardware constraints. But this would have been really cool if they went like hard down this route.
This early build feels like a prototype for concepts that wouldn't fully realize until much later generations. This particular sandbox-like design and dynamic camera remind me of Dragon Quest VII, giving me an open-world feel that almost no other Nintendo DS game has been able to accomplish. In my opinion, this build also hints at an alternate timeline, where Gamefreak could have pioneered the HD 2D art style, years before Square Enix popularized it, and shows just how close Gamefreak were to pushing those boundaries, only to refine their vision into what Black and White eventually became and the generations that followed. In November 2007, Square Enix released Dragon Quest IV for the Nintendo DS, a remake of a classic NES game. It showcased an early version of what we now recognize as the HD 2D style, blending 2D character sprites with a rotating 3D environment. While this approach initially drew criticism for feeling jarring and lacking some of the features,
people were so fucking stupid back then. This is such a great style. It's kind of rough in this game, but 2D sprites in a 3D world is so good.
Of the original NES game, it ultimately earned praise for its unique visuals. To the best of my knowledge, this was Square Enix's first step into the HD 2D style, a genre they would later refine, popularize, and even trademark. Don't worry, they trademarked the name and not the artistic approach itself. The August build of Pokemon Black and White feels like Game Freak's own experiment with a similar concept.
You say those people aren't still stupid. Fair.
Dramatically. It wasn't just a 2D game with a 3D camera, it felt closer to a fully realized 3D world, reminiscent of an MMO or an ambitious RPG adventure, and it's incredible that they managed to get something like this working on the Nintendo DS with minimal lag. Then again, it brings to mind games like GTA Chinatown Wars, which had an impressive adaptation.
That was a really cool game. This is the fact that a game like this exists is wild.
Of GTA 4's Liberty City that you sped across in cars for most of the time. But just imagine if Generation 5 took the bold step into the open world design. While there's no guarantee it would have been a hit, there is definitely untapped potential in this concept. If Game Freak had pursued this direction, I'd argue they might have been the ones to lead the charge in the HD 2D space, and not Square Enix. But the early Black and White concept gets even crazier. When we jump ahead to the November 2008 builds, these builds introduced multiple scenarios, each being developed by individual team members, showcasing different ideas in a 3D environment. One scenario focuses
I thought that was maybe like someone who'd like done like a fan version of it to get it running on a 3DS.
Sky Arrow Bridge, where players can walk around freely with a fully movable camera. I already love this sequence in the final game, but I love being able to look around and appreciate the set even more. The second scenario is based on Violet City, where you can also rotate your camera.
Official Minecraft 3DS edition. Oh, okay.
This feels like the most polished example of the open world HD 2D concept, and in my opinion, it shows that the idea could have worked for the entire game. The controls are surprisingly intuitive and functional, which is impressive given the DS's limited button layout, and it just looks really good. And might I point out...
Wait, so I guess the camera would have been controlled with the bumpers. That's the only way this would make sense to me.
Some of the cities in the final version of Pokemon Black and White make you feel like you can rotate your camera. It makes me wonder if Game Freak initially designed the region with this idea in mind, but ultimately scaled it back. Castelia City in particular feels like the closest realization of these early open world concepts. There's also an early battle view scenario featuring scrapped Pokemon.
What are these fucking beta sprites? Pokemon beta sprites are always super rough.
Designs, static view, but I believe in later builds you were able to rotate your camera within battle as well, and the perspective of a Pokemon would change based on whether you're in front of a Pokemon or not. It's understandable why Game Freak didn't include it in Generation 5. With no trainer models displayed during battles, it could easily get confusing.
Yeah, with battles, I don't really see any reason why you'd have a movable camera. But with the world, absolutely.
Figuring out which Pokemon belong to you. The final scenario in these builds is perhaps the most surprising, the platforming concept. This scenario places you in a crowded version of Celestic Town and introduces a jump mechanic. Yes, jumping in the overworld. You could freely hop around, scale small mountains.
I'm so happy they didn't include jumping in a... Yeah, that would be bad. We don't need DS platforming. In X, Y, and onwards, there is a rotating camera in battles while idling. Right, but it's rotating... The game's controlling the rotation, not you as the player. If you as the player control it, introduces a lot more a lot more potential bugs.
Entirely. While jumping over ledges seems like an obvious use case, it's hard to imagine how else this feature would have to fit in a traditional Pokemon game. It's possible Game Freak had grander plans for this mechanic, but they likely didn't find enough meaningful applications to justify its inclusion in the final game.
I guess on that note, ZA might be doing manual rotation, but ZA, like, by this point, we're full 3D. So if you're full 3D and you're doing rotation, like, that's understandable. Like, that's easy to do.
Interestingly, the platformer scenario uses the DS's touchscreen for both jumping and camera control. While I personally prefer the button controls for the camera, the touchscreen implementation works surprisingly well and frees up the rest of the buttons for other gameplay functions. It's a clever use of the DS's capabilities, even if it ultimately didn't make the cut. Honestly,
Am I forgetting which one? Okay, no, my bad. I forgot the XY was full. Okay, my bad. Yeah. Okay, right. I'm misremembering when things happened.
Giant roaming Charizards make me think that maybe they planned wild Pokemon in the overworld as far back as 2008.
Oh god.
Although I kind of understand why it took so long to make this feature work. On the Nintendo DS, rendering 3D models for every Pokemon in an area would have been a technical nightmare, and even the 3DS likely couldn't have handled such an idea without significant compromises. So it wasn't until Pokemon Let's Go on the Nintendo Switch that the series finally embraced this concept. One consistent detail across these builds is the use of a Heart Gold and Soul
Right, okay, that's the one that made everything every flying Pokemon T-pose.
Silver protagonist sprite. Initially, the builds feature the Johto protagonist sprites, which were later replaced with Beta Generation 5 designs. Then it swapped to Sinnoh protagonists, and eventually returned to another set of Beta Generation 5 sprites, before settling on the final designs that we see in Black and White.
I will say she's
how
cute.
would an open world 2D style Pokemon game like
protagonist.
this even work? Well, firstly, it would need to embrace a semi-open world structure, with interconnected open routes that are maybe a bit more linear than a traditional open world game, but still offer a sense of freedom. 2D Pokemon sprites could roam these routes in real time, creating a dynamic world. This approach would give the game a distinct blend of Pokemon's traditional gameplay and the open world feel of games like Dragon Quest. Controlling your camera would be a bit more limited than these early builds. I think just using L and R to turn your camera around is more than enough control. The jumping mechanic introduced in these early builds add a whole different layer. While it's certainly a unique idea for a Pokemon game, its functionality would depend heavily on the overall design. Jumping works naturally in platformers.
Jumping, if they introduced jumping, there would be so many skips that exist.
Where traversal is a central gameplay element, but in an RPG like Pokemon, it would need a clear purpose to avoid feeling like a gimmick. Perhaps if a game leaned into exploration, like scaling mountains, clearing obstacles, or reaching hidden areas, the mechanic could play a meaningful role. This would require a shift towards action-adventure gameplay, blending Pokemon's core mechanics with elements from traditional JRPGs. Regardless, I'm sure Square Enix had a huge inspiration on how Game Freak wanted to evolve their style. I do believe a game like this could have worked, but I also have a good theory on why Game Freak never went this experimental route, and I'm pretty sure you have the same idea. It just comes down to the time frame Game Freak had. Game Freak is a relatively small studio, and there were
212 employees, shut the fuck up, relatively small studio.
much smaller in 2008. When you're given a tight 2-year window to develop the next generation of Pokemon, the pressure is on to deliver a game that doesn't disappoint.
Imagine if they were just given time to make a good game. What a crazy concept that is.
Fans and meets the expectations set by previous entries. And I still think that Game Freak managed to make amazing games in Pokemon Black and White. It still pushed boundaries, and we got some great 3-dimensional elements in the games. And it was the closest Game Freak ever were to the quote-unquote HD 2D style. They still managed to give it...
Imagine how much money they would make if they delayed it by like a year or two, and how many people who really enjoyed Pokemon as a kid would come back if they made a truly exceptional Pokemon game. Made something where it truly felt like they were actually taking advantage of the hardware and wasn't like a buggy mess and really laggy.
Ended soft reboot feel and put a big focus on storytelling, and they didn't need a huge open world to do it. There simply just wasn't enough time or resources to push their initial ideas to their full potential. A lot of people claim that this was the most ambitious Game Freak had ever been. Of course, Pokemon was evolving in the 2D space, constantly pushing the boundaries of what the series could achieve. If Game Freak had stuck with a 2D style from Generation 6 onward, I truly believe that they could have pioneered the genre in a way that no other developer could, perhaps even surpassing the likes of...
But they weren't. Scarlet and Violet was the best Pokemon best selling Pokemon games ever. Yeah. That's why. The problem is Pokemon fans are more than happy to eat shit. And the reason why they eat shit is there's no competitor. There is 0 competitors to Pokemon. And the main reason for that is people don't want a competitor to Pokemon, they want Pokemon. Even if there's a competitor that does everything better, where's my Pikachu? Where's my Zubat, right? Like, nothing can compete with Pokemon because people are there for the Pokemon, not for the game.
Square Enix in terms of innovation. But because they made the shift to 3D with Generation 6, it's almost like they restarted all of that evolution that they were building in 2D in order to even build a Pokemon foundation in 3D. While we're beginning to see Pokemon evolve in 3D with recent generations, I still think there's so much untapped potential in the 2D space. So in the future, I would love to see Game Freak revisit the 2D genre and create a proper HD 2D Pokemon game.
The only way you're going to get a HD 2D Pokemon game is if a third-party studio makes it. Game Freak is never going to make a interesting Pokemon game. Every interesting Pokemon game has come from a third-party studio. Whether we're talking Gale of Darkness, Mystery Dungeon, Ranger, Let's Go, Legends. Like, every interesting Pokemon game is not a Game Freak game.
I'm not talking about outsourcing it to another studio.
That's the only way it's going to happen. That is the only way it's going to happen. Game Freak is never going to make an interesting title.
Because I think Game Freak is a creative company that is limited by tight schedules. And if they had the time to focus on a solid HD 2D game, it could be incredible. Especially if they collaborated with another studio like Square Enix, instead of just handing the concept over. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so feel free to drop a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, and maybe even share it with a friend to get their perspective on the matter. If you haven't yet, now that we've explored the scrapped content of one of the most
Snap
fascinating...
as well, there's another one.
And if they I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so feel free to drop a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, and maybe even share it with a friend to get their perspective on the matter. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss whatever I post next. And thank you for watching.
That was fun. I enjoyed that.